cited by Edward Said in his work on Orientalism, cited by Syed Hussein Alatas, the Malaysian sociologist, who actually created a trajectory which should have been the normal trajectory for all historical work in India, because as we know, Sardar Panikkar wrote historical novels on Panashi Raja. He also wrote on the Dutch in Malabar, the Portuguese in Malabar, and then went on to write a very significant synthetic work on the place of the sea in the imagination of India, not only Kerala, and understanding the place of the ocean as a determining factor on any terrestrial relations. Underlying this, of course, was the moving away from a very myopic Hindu history of land to understanding the presence of Jews, Christians, Muslims in the making of Kerala. And this is an important thing that we need to think about. Now, when we think about MGS's work was preternaturally, in some sense, in advance of its time. And it's interesting that MGS's book, the 1972 book, Cultural Symbiosis in Kerala, actually did what a lot of younger scholarship is beginning to engage with, that the sea was constantly present in the Malayali imagination. And I'll read you a sentence from the Cultural Symbiosis in Kerala, which I reread again, thanks to Dilip, who sent me a photocopy. And MGS says in the introduction to the book, the expectation of wealth and support from the mysterious ocean could be described as a fixation in the mind of Keralites. So in many senses, even as MGS was articulating an argument about the Perumals of Kerala, about land relations, he always saw the sea as the persistent penumbral presence, right, which determined in many senses the history of Kerala. So for instance, the book Cultural Symbiosis in Kerala deals with the early settlements of Buddhists, Jains, Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Kerala with the active patronage and assistance of Orthodox Hindu kings. Right? So you had Orthodox Hindu kings who did not see it as aberrant, who did not see it as something that was out of the ordinary, to actually allow for the settlement and the engagement with groups who are non-Hindus. So if one thinks about MGS's work, right, written way back in 1972, it offers an interesting antidote to the kinds of imagination that currently dominate in India when we think with the growth of the powers of Hindutva, the rise of a Hindu nationalist government at the center, the Citizenship Amendment Act, the relation to the refugees coming out of Afghanistan as to who can come into India and so on. The very idea of a Hinduism versus Hindutva idea that we are battling with right now, MGS's work created a paradigm in which, as he says, with the active patronage and assistance of Orthodox Hindu kings, there was still continued to be an engagement with people who came from other religions, other geographies, and so on. And he again makes a very interesting point in this book where he says there was no confrontation or conflict with these groups, and importantly, no fusion either, which is why he prefers the word symbiosis over synthesis. And in many senses, if one looks at the arguments of a benign Hindutva, the idea is that all groups, all religious groups over time will come to be engulfed in the Hindu fold, right? They will become good Hindus over a period of time. But no conflict, nor fusion, right? Neither of these, but a process of symbiosis, where over a period of time, some of the minority religions like Jains got absorbed with the Nayars, the Buddhists with the Iravas, and the Buddhist imagination then surfaces again in Kumaran Ashan's writing, for example, the idea of the king who left for Mecca. So in multiple ways, one cannot think the history of Kerala without the ocean, without the presence of these multiple religions, without the understanding that there has been a symbiosis in the creation of Kerala, which stands in many senses as a paradigm that one can invoke in a period of in the period of crisis that we are all in, a period of historical crisis that we are in India, where the forces of fundamentalism seek to define India as being Hindu. Okay? So I'll stop there, and I'll stop there also to acknowledge how MGS's work for me, the more I read it, has always for me been about this engagement with history, an engagement with politics, an engagement with the younger generation, and a deep commitment to creating a scholarship on Kerala that is open ended. And so I'll stop there. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak.
Thank you so much, Dilip, for pointing at two paradigms and possibilities of a fluid overlap between them through the works of MGS. So pointing simultaneously at the conflicts as well as the possibilities of overlapping, so to say. I would now request Manu V. Devadevan to speak on MGS Narayanan, the KERALOLPATTI, and the root of military fiscalism in Kerala. Dr. Manu, please.
Thank you, Dr. Dileep Raj and Dr. Dineshan. Can you all hear me? Am I audible?
Yes, can we see you as well?
I'm sorry, my camera has not been working for almost a month now, and the computer people in Mandi were not able to fix it. So they said they'll have to take it to Chandigarh, which means I have to stay away from my laptop for 10 days, or I have to go to Chandigarh myself, which means I have to be on quarantine for 10 days after when I'm back. So these are both luxuries that I cannot presently offer. So I'm sorry about that. It's a great honor to be here to speak about a historian who is a teacher to my teacher. Please let me know when to stop. I can just go on for ages. I have not prepared a lecture because I thought that this is an event where you speak with your heart, not with your mind. MGS's presence in Kerala as a historian and as a public intellectual, can I believe hardly be overstated. We all know that. The annual session of the Indian History Congress for 1976 was held in Calicut. It was held in the University of Calicut. MGS was the head of the department then, the history department, and Sukumar Arikode was the vice chancellor of the university. MGS brought E.P. Thompson to the History Congress as a special guest. There was no internet back then. Those were the days of the emergency, and I don't think an ISD call from Kozhikode to the United Kingdom was possible in 1976. So this was the time when much of Thompson's intellectual energies was spent on bombarding Althusser. He was writing The Poverty of Theory. But he came to Kerala, he came to Kozhikode, and the full credit of this goes to MGS. MGS was 44 years old at the time. I'm 44 years old now, and I can't imagine organizing such an event today when technology and communication are much advanced than what it was in 1976. I have not met MGS for how many years? 2008. So that's a good 13 years. And even before that, I met him only about half a dozen times. But each time, it was a 5 or 6 hour long meeting. The first of these meetings was at the venue of a conference in Bangalore. This was the conference of the Numismatic Society of India in 2006. And the rest of the meetings were at his residence in Malapparamba. I always called him in the morning. He always said, Nala Veru. And I immediately took a bus from Bangalore to Kozhikode. Reached there in the evening, found a room in a lodge near the bus station, or if Abhilash was around, I went to his house in Koilandi and went to meet MGS the next morning. And what conversations they were. I know that what I'm going to speak today can hardly be respects enough when I look back at the extent of what I have learned from the conversations that I had with him. I learned from his writings, but a substantial measure of what I know about Kerala, about the history of Kerala, comes from the conversations that I had with him and not necessarily from his writings. I'm sorry I've given an ambitious title for the talk today, but what I'm going to share with you is not something that is really profound. Much of it is quite commonplace. I read the Keralolpatti for the first time on 31st December 1999. There's a reason for remembering the date so well. I was a railway employee back then. There weren't many computers in the railway divisional office in Hubli, Karnataka, where I was working. So in my office, which is the office of the senior divisional engineer, there were more than 100 employees, but only about 7 or 8 computers. And there were only about 10 people who knew how to operate computers, and I happened to be one of them. This time, we had instructions to finish off all computer related works for the month before the 30th of December and not use computers for a few days after that. This was because of the Y2K threat. So I completed my work a few days earlier and came to Kerala on a 10-day holiday. I spent a few days at home. That's in Annamanada, roughly midway between Mala and Chalakudi. And then I went to Eruva, which is a place near Kayangulam. My maternal uncle and aunt lived there, and my maternal grandma was staying with her at the time. I had been there before, but this time I happened to observe something that I had not noticed on earlier occasions. The whole area was full of sand. You see, one only saw sand everywhere. It was just sand, sand, and sand. And it was obvious that the sand had been there forever. It was not brought from elsewhere for construction work or for some other purpose. And as if to make matters worse, the name of my aunt's family, Veetupere, was Manalur. Manalur. Now I knew that the sea was about 6 or 7 kilometers away, not the sea, but the Kayangulam Kail. So I told my aunt's husband that this place seems to have been submerged under the sea a few thousand years ago. Why else do we find sand everywhere? He said yes. He said everybody knows that. പരശുരാമ മഴ ഇറങ്ങിയപ്പോ കടല് പിൻവാങ്ങിയതല്ലേ. Now, I didn't grow up in Kerala. I grew up in Bangalore. So I was not familiar with this legend back then. So I asked him, where is this written? He said it's not written anywhere, but everybody knows the story. And that's when his brother intervened, his elder brother. He said, wait, it's actually written. It's there in the Keralolpatthi. So the next day, which is the 31st of December, I found a copy of the Keralolpatthi in a public library. Now, the first thing that struck me when I read the text was the sense of something that was on almost every page. Shall I call it fear? Sense of fear, perhaps. It was like reading the Bill of Rights of the American Constitution. You know, the fundamental rights of the Indian Constitution is what shall I say? It's a document of confidence. It's a document of dignity. It has a vision that's there for all of us to see. Now, never mind that it's only on paper, but it's still there. But the Bill of Rights, on the other hand, is a document born of fear. The fear of losing one's liberty and the fear of losing one's property is so striking in the Bill of Rights. I don't think one can actually miss that at all. And that's more or less the sense I had when I read the Keralolpatthi. One can read the Keralolpatthi as a document which tells us who's protecting what. In fact, this begins on the very first page, you know. The second sentence of Gundar's version has something like "Nootarubadu Kadam Bhumi Indaki, Malayala Bhumike Raksha Venam ennu kalpichu." And then you have 36,000 Brahmananmar Rakshichu, Kazhagam Kodi Rakshichu, Avarodha Nambimar Rakshichu, Val Nambi Rakshichu, Pinandakya, Angal Rakshichu. In fact, on one occasion, this is at the very beginning of the text, there was nobody else to protect Kerala. So that was because everybody had fled due to the fear of serpents. So there we have Nagattan Mardana Rakshichu. അവരെ കൊണ്ടൊന്നും സാധിക്കില്ല എന്നുള്ള സ്ഥിതി ഉണ്ടായപ്പോ രാജാവിനെ കൊണ്ടുവന്നു, രാജാവ് രക്ഷിച്ചു. രക്ഷിക്കാൻ വേണ്ടി ദൈവങ്ങളെ ഉണ്ടാക്കി, രക്ഷിക്കാൻ വേണ്ടി അകമ്പടിക്കാരെ ഉണ്ടാക്കി. I didn't quite understand what was happening. And then when I went to JNU for my MA, I happened to read a bit of Kerala history. This was for a seminar paper that I was doing on the early history of Christianity in Kerala. So that's when I happened to read MGS, Cultural Symbiosis, Reinterpretations, his Indian History Congress papers, Adisthana Shilagal, of which there was a copy in the Central Secretariat Library. This is the one housed within the National School of Drama campus in Mandi House, where there was a wonderful librarian called Karunagar. Now, MGS's PhD thesis was published in 1996, a good 23 years after he was awarded his PhD. Only about 100 copies were printed, I believe, and it was meant for private circulation. One of my teachers in JNU, Professor Vijaya Ramaswamy, had a photocopy of this book. Now, I read all these works. Now, MGS had written about the hundreds organization that we have in Kerala in the Chera period, Munnootuvar, Ainootuvar, Arunootuvar, and he had shown that the Munnootuvar was an individual entrusted with the security of a locality, and that he had about 300 soldiers attached to him, 300 soldiers at his disposal, and hence the number. And the Ainootuvar had 500 soldiers, the Arunootuvar had 600, and so on. The king had 1,000 troops attached to him. This was the item. Now, MGS argued that this security arrangement was part of the state apparatus. I'm not really sure if he actually used the word apparatus, but he held that this was an essential component of the state and that it was prescribed in texts such as the Arthashastra. So this was a very different understanding from the way in which the military was imagined by historians of an earlier generation. Military for them meant a standing army, or mercenary troops, or troops at the disposal of subordinates. Call them feudatories, call them tributaries, or one can call them anything based on their sense of political correctness. But they were subordinates who were expected to render military service to the state when called upon to do so. So this was the existing picture. I'm afraid that's more or less the same picture we have today, even for other parts of India, but not in Kerala. Not in Kerala. And that's because MGS showed that the militia was an essential component of agrarian life. It was not simply a body of soldiers fighting war after war with outsiders, that is with other states, or with insiders, that is with the recalcitrant Samantas. So their presence in the towns and the countryside, their presence in the temples, in the royal holdings of the land, and in several activities such as providing security, collecting revenue, and managing the money belonging to the temple, that is gold. This was the nature of their presence. This presence was ubiquitous. We don't actually come across the idea of 32 Brahmana villages in Kerala in the Chera period. That is the 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th century. That's a later day invention. But many of the 32 villages mentioned in the KERALOLPATTI actually existed in the Chera times. And in inscriptions of the Chera period, there is copious reference to the militia in the village settlements. Not only in the settlements named in the KERALOLPATTI, but in a number of other settlements as well. Tirunelli, for instance, or Trikkakara. We have the Airam, which is the royal body of troops. We have the Nuttur. We have functionaries entrusted with security, such as Ulpadan. Ulpadan is the earlier form of Tirumulpadu. The Nilambur Raja, for example, is a Tirumulpadu. ഒരിക്കലൊരു തമാശ ഉണ്ടായിട്ടോ, ഞാനും അഭിലാഷും കൂടി തിരുമുൽപ്പാടിനെ കാണാൻ നിലമ്പൂർക്ക് പോയി. കണ്ടു, ചായയൊക്കെ കുടിച്ചു, and then His Majesty said, my father was the first environmentalist in the world. Well, that's just an aside. So we have Ulpadan in the Chera inscriptions. There is Nizhal, which is a local body of troops. Now, historians who wrote before MGS were of the view that Nizhal was the shade and Nizhalirikal was sitting in the shade. MGS showed that Nizhal was, of course, shade, but a shade of a different kind. It referred to the shade or the protection provided by the militia. It referred to the Agambadi troops. The Chera inscriptions also refers very often to Raksha, to Kaval, and so on. So what we have here is a political structure deeply rooted in an agrarian economy where men who are authorized to carry weapons with them are just about everywhere. You see them everywhere. This is in itself quite scary, and that's when, as if this wasn't enough, one of his MA students, Keshavan Velathat, went to JNU for his MPhil. He had already absorbed his idea concerning the militia from MGS, like a piece of sponge, I should say. Now, sitting in JNU, He was, I believe, venting out his anger against Indira Gandhi's police network during the emergency by writing a paper that was scarier than what MGS had written. This paper has in fact turned out to be an iconic piece in Indian history. It's called the Chattas and Bhattas. In fact, Keshavan was in the habit of arguing with everyone when he disagreed with the views they had expressed. He did not quite care for who it was that he was arguing with. And he frequently argued with two of his teachers in JNU. Brajadulal Chattopadhyay and Sabyasachi Bhattacharya. So the joke doing its rounds in JNU was Chatta and Bhatt were actually Chattopadhyay and Bhattacharya. Now, in this particular paper, Keshavan showed that the system of schooling that was prevalent between the 7th and the 12th century was mostly tilted towards military training. So if a boy went to a school such as Kandalur Shalai to learn, say, grammar or mathematics, it was not unlikely that he came back as an expert on grammar or mathematics. But even if he had not learnt these disciplines, he would certainly have picked up the art of knocking off a few heads with a sword. We get this impression from Keshavan's description of Kandalur Shalai. Now, I don't know if T.D. Ramakrishnan was actually familiar with this paper when he wrote Sugandhi and Andal Devanayaki. I think he was. Anyway, this was the character of the institutional forms of learning in Chera times, and Keshavan's paper showed that this was true for the whole of India, not Kerala alone. Now, the KERALOLPATTI is a product of the 17th and 18th century. There's a consensus among historians concerning this, and the earliest versions may not be actually older than the late 16th century, the last decades of the 16th century. So the Vijayanagara king, Krishnaraya, is mentioned in a number of versions, and he's already a legendary figure in the text. In fact, we have a version that was written in 1596, and this happens to be the oldest known manuscript, which carries a date. Maybe there are older manuscripts, but this is the one that has a date. Now, the 17th and 18th centuries were known for what may be called martialization of everyday life. That's a big expression, actually, but we get the sense from K.N. Ganesh's work on Kunjan Nambiar. Now, martialization becomes a widely endorsed ethic, a widely sought after ethic, so to speak. So this was the age of military fiscalism. Military fiscalism is a phrase that the historian Martin Wolf used for the first time. That was in 1972 when he wrote a book called The Fiscal System of Renaissance France. Wolf was actually a veteran of the Second World War. He was a radio operator in one of the troop carrier squadrons of the US Air Force from 1943 to 45. Now, his experience in the army seems to have helped him to gain a set of interesting insights into the functioning of the army. And after he began teaching in the University of Pennsylvania in 1953, he developed the idea of military fiscalism. So this is a practice in which the state has the military as the modus operandi for its operations. And the realization of the fiscal potentials of the state is dependent on its military capabilities and vice versa. Now it was Bertenstein who suggested that military fiscalism is a good lens with which to look at the political and economic processes of South India in the 17th and 18th century. And I believe that for the first time in his life, Bertenstein actually got it right. Sanjay Subramanian was in fact critical of this idea. He did not make a critique, so far as I can tell, but only said that it was a Western idea borrowed out of context. And he proposed revenue farming as an alternative to understand the political economy of the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, my work shows that revenue farming was in fact a big thing in this period, but it actually is an older practice, which goes back to the 5th and 6th centuries. So I think there is great merit in the military fiscalism thesis and the revenue farming thesis. What we actually see in the 17th and 18th century is the convergence of the two. And KERALOLPATTI is a place where we see both of these factors intersecting in very interesting ways. Now, MGS, of course, did not speak about military fiscalism. He doesn't invoke the idea of revenue farming either. But his work suggests that military fiscalism is not appearing in what shall I say, in terra incognita. It's not appearing out of nowhere in the context of widespread monetization. It has a history. It has a history that goes back to the Chera times. It has its roots in the Nutur and the Nizhal and Ulpadan and Kaval of the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. So what we see in the 18th century is not an extension or expansion of what we have in the 10th century. That is a very wrong impression to make. It is actually a transformation of the old military structures that we see in the 17th and 18th century. The old militia is, in the course of time, exposed to money. It is exposed to a military labor market that is under the firm control of local chiefs, warlords, military labor entrepreneurs, and others. And it is exposed to a state that has become a preeminent trader. The state itself is a major trader there. So the Cheras or the Cholas or the Hoysalas or the Kalyana Chalukyas were powers that facilitated trade, encouraged traders, made a fortune from the revenue that trade generated, and on some occasions made traders a part of the state's revenue collection mechanism itself. But the state was not a de facto trader. That's a new situation. Historians trace it to the 16th century, but I believe that it goes back to the 15th century. It begins in the Bahmani state during the regency of Mahmud Gawan in the 1460s. I believe there is a wonderful story waiting to be told about how the agrarian militia of the 10th and 11th century powers transformed into a military labor market and eventually into military fiscalism. So a good way to begin the story is by reflecting upon MGS's writings on the Chera period militia. I'll stop with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Manu. So, Dilip has taken only 17 minutes, and you also spoke 1 minute less than 20 minutes. So, I think Manu has coalesced many threads, and we can see the convergence of what you call military fiscalism and revenue farming in KERALOLPATTI. That is what I took from your speech. And I think the period to which you referred, from 10th century to 15th and 16th century, is one way of genealogically capturing our present. With that words, now I request Dr. Sanal Mohan, who happens to be one of MGS's students and who had focused more on the so-called modern period, to speak about memory and experience. Dr. Sanal Mohan, please. You have to unmute, Sanal Raj.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Dilip. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be on this panel along with my friends, Professor Dileep Menon, Manu Devadevan, and Ansari. And also we had excellent reflections last evening on MGS influence on other scholars, senior people who work with him. And obviously we have tomorrow another session where another dimension of MGS career, life, influence, etc. would be discussed. And yes, I happen to be one of those students who benefited from the immense scholarship of MGS, not just scholarship, his affection, personal concern, and so, all that, which in fact Dilip Menon had already recalled. So for us who studied in the Department of History, University of Calicut, I think MGS was a pillar of support, and there were many others, other teachers who supported us, and I remember everybody. And my research, in fact, was research which led to PhD was under a philosopher, but I did MPhil in the Department of History under historians. So therefore, I confidently state that I learned the basics of historical research as a student of that department with MGS, Professor Kurup, and many other teachers. Of course, Professor MP Sri Kumaran Nair and many others who in fact taught us the basics of that. So therefore, it is a wonderful occasion to be part of this, and I'm extremely glad that I was part of that group of students who benefited from NGS scholarship. Now, I am thankful to BOOKART and Code Life for having invited me for this NGS at 90 Historians Craft and Kerala's Fast. And I will stick to time, as Dileep Raj said. So when I was asked to talk this evening, I suggested that I can reflect on the questions of memory and experience. In fact, when I started my research, initially for my MPhil at University of Calicut, I worked in the area of peasant studies, and that took me to reading a little bit on caste societies, the questions of power, and so on. But mostly those days the works were more nationalistic, which I'm really afraid now. I'm no longer. I mean, I ceased to be a nationalist long back, and I think it is Kamba at the minimum. And I think so. Those days have been gone, and I thought we need to think about non-state histories, and of course. I still remember having kind of communication with Dilip and many other scholars who were working on Kerala at that time. And then when I started my work on the caste society, so one of the things that struck me was, in spite of caste being talked about as part of agrarian structure, society, and so on, we did not have much about the experiences of the sections of society that actually provided the labor. So this is a question. So one could say, well, from we could approach this from political economy side. Economic historians have been talking things about labor and all that. So I was also fascinated by that. But then I found that when it comes to everyday life, people can obviously disagree with me. We do not find much in these writings. So this is my feeling. In fact, even in Irfan Habib's agrarian system, we get to know about slavery and other kinds of things. But when it comes to this everyday experience, I thought there is something which is really absent. And so therefore, when I started my research on slavery, so I thought that it's very, very how much the whole idea of slave experience, as I have a critical look at their own experiences. So that is a moment when one would say that this particular experience that they had, maybe of oppression, maybe of the pain and sufferings that they had. Those experiences began to really transform such individuals and frame them in a particular way that they are able to start a discourse of this particular experience. And therefore, we find that one level, the individuals who had a particular kind of experience, trying to reflect back on that and then capture it in a different way. It could be used as a sort of a political strategy to oppose, domination and so on. Now, therefore, in such a context, experience becomes something very different, and the people who talk about experiences of that kind will be giving a very different kind of idea about what it was all about. Quite different from others who also had experienced the same thing. So this is something which was beautifully articulated in Joanne Scott's wonderful essay, Evidence of Experience. So she talks about that. Now, when I read this sort of materials, I thought that, and also I was doing a lot of field work and, collecting stories, listening to narratives and so on. So therefore I found that, okay, this making stories or narrating stories in that sense actually, gets involved in making individual cells in societies and so on. So therefore, I thought that this is one way we could really deepen our understanding of Kerala's experience, particularly of the enslaved communities. And I'm not saying that I'm the first person to have done research of that kind. We have a lot of scholars, including, most prominently the late Professor Sharada Mani and others who had done work in this particular area. But my interest was to see how much was this memory available in society. So therefore, so the idea was in a sense to complicate particular narrative in the sense that social memory obviously is a constructed one. So as I am talking about the memories of the oppressed communities or people who have undergone traumas of different kinds, so one would say that that one also has an effect of construction as much as the memory of the dominant social groups or communities and so on. Ultimately, what would happen is that when historians work with the material of memory, they have to be aware of the kind of this is something which Dominic Capra himself pointed out, the tricks of memory he talks about. And I'm sure that this is something which can happen in any context. We can really construct these memories and make them completely away from probably the kind of experience that one particular society had. So for want of time, I'm not going into the details of that. So my concern was really to look at this sort of things and see how we can really write a critical history which will cover, which I'm sure could be taken back in time to different historical periods. Obviously we need to have researchers and history source materials to talk about that. And if that is available, I think that would be a fantastic occasion, fantastic context when we could really have, a very substantial kind of critical histories being talked about. And therefore, I'm just opening up this, and I don't have much time. And therefore, what I want to, really open up is the possibilities of, critically reading the archive, and then this back and forth ethnographic movement. That is on one side, and then the possibilities of working with the material of memory to write the critical history. So I stop here. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the inconveniences caused.
Thanks, Anil Mash. And you, even with that disruptions, you stopped 2 minutes before. So
Oh, really? That was very sad.
I thought you were a bit tensed about time.
Yeah.
A historian, that is. Now, thanks so much for again correlating the personal journey as well as a methodological breakthrough that you found in your own research. And one of the blessings that we have in such occasions is the way in which all of you speak simultaneously about your personal experiences as well as the methodological implications of the work done by you and others in the field. So thank you so much. And now I would request Dr. M.T. Ansari, who might be the odd man out here because he's from a literature department and at least for 2 decades now, it's people from English literature and other disciplines who have done much work regarding Kerala's past. So Ansari's work to me have shown how a non-modern Islamic other was constructed through colonial procedures and how that figure continued to live in various discourses. So I have requested him to speak by focusing on text or literature as primary source, and I hope he will speak by way of responding to my request and other speeches here. Ansari, please.
Thank you, Dileep Raj, and good evening. Welcome to all the listeners. Before I proceed, some people seem to have acute problem with the audio, and probably they should just exit and rejoin because other people are able to hear. Because I so constantly hands being raised about the audio. There's a suggestion that sometimes exiting and rejoining may improve the situation. Yeah, I much appreciate this opportunity to listen and interact with established as well as young and upcoming scholars on Kerala history. To my discredit, I don't have a kind of personal connection with Professor MGS, but he was constantly a part of our discussions when I was doing MPhil at Calicut University. The brief given to me by Dileep Raj was actually to be a respondent to the previous speakers. And I also hope that, unlike yesterday, there will be sufficient time for taking questions today. So with all those things in mind, I will keep my brief response to maybe within 10 minutes or so. Thanks to Dilip Menon for bringing that panoramic view of M.G. and his work in terms of territorial versus maritime histories, time in terms of sacred and secular. And for me, more interesting when Dilip Menon talked about space, configuration of space in a different way, from a nationalist historiography to a civilizational map. What in a sense, what Dilip actually qualified it as world historical, right? From a region-specific or nation-specific to a world historical format. Which is one of the things that I probably will touch towards the end of this short response. Thanks also to Manu V for bringing out the intricacies of socio-cultural history as revealed by detailed and deep mining of historical material by M.G. NARAYANAN, which is completely, totally out of the world, admirable. And as both speakers and also Sanal Mohan pointed out, so it is laudable for not only M.G. is laudable for not only what he did or what his work did, but what he and his work also enabled. And I'm sure that tradition will continue in the Kerala historiographical tradition, even though what I'm going to say may be a little critical. As Dilip also acknowledged, Dileep Raj also acknowledged, more a topic enforced by Dileep Raj. And I'm not saying anything new, nor is this a proper presentation, but only an attempt to raise certain issues for joint deliberation. Actually, that was the first point where Dileep Raj, when he got in touch with me to say that it is to promote conversation. And also, it is indeed awkward for me to respond to experts in social sciences, especially history. As Dileep Raj again said, as an outsider or a token person dabbling in the humanities, about the historian's craft, the rich texture of which has already been made clear today itself. One of my concerns have been to read history as literature and literature as history. In fact, there wasn't much direct literary material on the 1921 rebellion, which is one of my focus. Apart from Donald Sinderby's 1927 novel, The Jewel of Malabar, and some references in Kumarnashan, Urup's Sundaramarum, etc., etc. But significantly, what I did was to trace references to Malabar and the Muslim in other literary texts, which was prior to 1921. So, starting from Indilega and even before. To trace references to Malabar and the Muslim in other literary texts, which were to be mined. This literary strategy of reading the manifest and latent contents, to use Freudian concepts, to read the manifest and latent contents, or to read the expressions and slippages as figures of a residual unconscious, was extended to various historical material as well. So, what using literary text as primary source also does is to enable a multi-layered reading of non-literary material, which would be common knowledge by now. My limited knowledge of MGS is alert to a central feature of his work. Instead of dismissing myths and legends, he tried to read them as records of socio-cultural history. An innovation then. But nonetheless, when reading MGS, again thanks to Dileep Raj for sending some of the books recently, which are not available to me because of the COVID situation as well. Nonetheless, one still finds a strong dependence on history as a scientific method, as the scientific method which constructs, produces, or cults out an objective truth. So, the difference between disciplinary rigor and rigidity is not generalizable. They cannot apply this across all the disciplines. The thin and thick descriptions may vary in various disciplinary formations. The blurring of distinction between various disciplines is a definite part of the interdisciplinary approach. And various thinkers have already questioned the distinction between philosophy and literature, and later between history and literature. Nevertheless, as a pedagogy and as a practice, philosophy and to some extent history also seems to retain, at times desperately, its disciplinary foundations and protocols. While literature, the literature department, at most times seem to be ready, sometimes much too quickly and easily, to exceed the margins. In a webinar in which we conducted recently, probably three weeks back, Sundar Sarkai also agreed to this observation that when I made this comment that in comparison to various disciplines in India, let me just read out. As Sundar Sarkai agreed during a recent webinar, it could be because philosophy never faced a sustained crisis in India. Definitely not in Kerala either. So I'm going to take this notion of a crisis. Without a crisis in the discipline itself, which philosophy probably never faced. And one of the reasons why the philosophy departments in Kerala, particularly, as well as most places, seem to have a different kind of orientation. So philosophy never faced a sustained crisis in India, nor in Kerala for that matter. And the same could be extended to history, which still works well within the parameters of a nationalist destination. Even though there are quite a lot of people present here who have been as Dilip Menon also mentioned, the territorial to maritime to civilizational space. But still a national destination. Nation as the desired destiny of this historical practice. That is where it was all leading. And it is always then a tracing back of the different routes through which we reach this destination. And which is still mostly practiced in metropolitan locations. While literature, particularly English literature in India, has had to cope with a deep sense of crisis. In fact, if you take comparative literature, it has been a series of crises. So it started off with the question of the canon for English literature. And the story is even truer with regard to comparative literature in India. One may recall the status of anthropology in contemporary world, which is one of the best examples because of the deep disciplinary crisis, not a crisis, a political crisis from outside, but a felt disciplinary crisis, which again are not applicable to India, in how it coped with its colonial and liberal humanist baggage to become one of the most vibrant disciplines of our times now. A possibility is that the disciplines which encounter an internal crisis also are forced to a decontextualization and a recontextualization. And here I am borrowing words, phrases from Shashi Jagde, who has a book by that title is Decontextualization and Recontextualization, which of course many people will recall Delucia. Or in a much more later formulation, a decolonization of knowledge, of the very tools and concepts of knowledge production. To me, this crisis becomes evident in the way our disciplines deal with concepts of culture and civilization. Here I would probably disagree with Dilip Menon a bit, because what happened in that move to a world historical stage was only annexing Kerala's history to India's history to world history. So that is one of the reasons why a decolonization of knowledge, protocols of knowledge, which I'm sure, I'm not making a blanket statement about everybody, it is obviously evident in works of many people, but not from a disciplinary formation, at least not in India, definitely not in Kerala. And as I said, most of this interesting work seems to be also happening outside Kerala, on Kerala but outside Kerala. Which is again not to malign people who are doing excellent work in Kerala, from Kerala, within Kerala. While it could be said that the best work of the past 30 odd years seems to have been impelled by a focus on culture, it seems to have had the sad effect of abandoning notions of civilization. And this will be my concluding point to throw open for debate. That because of a focus on culture, we seem to have abandoned notions of civilization, and abandoned in such a manner that other people are so easy for most other people or some other people to claim that argument, to take over the civilization argument. And here, of course, there are echoes of the German and French culture civilization. I'm not very particularly keen on that aspect of it. So, to make a short and upward conclusion, what is required is to maintain a dialogic or even a dialectical relation between culture and civilization, so that one is not immersed too much in one and abandons or lost in either, so that the stage becomes open for dubious, if spurious theorization. So, yeah, very brief, but I would expect more discussion to come following this. Thank you, Dilip.
Thanks, Ansari, for provoking conversations. So, personally, too, Ansari put me in a tight spot by pointing to the lack of crisis to the philosophy departments in Kerala. And I would quickly, in 1 minute, respond to that and open the forum up for discussions. If any of you want to make comments, live comments, please do let know in the comment box, or speak in the popcorn style, going by the clubhouse culture. I think the reason why there is a lack of crisis or reflection in the philosophy departments might be due to the very origin of the discipline philosophy in India, which in a sense equates philosophy with the Hindu nationhood. So we are not supposed to problematize nationhood. Instead, we are supposed to speak from a location which is outside that sanctorium. In that sense, I think unlike the historians who are tracing the genealogy of the nationhood and trying to problematize the notion of nationhood, philosophy as a discipline tend to celebrate the Indianness to a large extent. That is what I found as an insider. With that, I would request, if nobody is volunteering, I'm sure many of you will be having comments. Nobody is volunteering. I would request the panelists themselves, if they want to add or respond to something, they can go ahead. Or Dinesh Mash also, Abhilash, our directors can also take a lead. So the forum is open. Dilip, would you like to respond briefly to Ansari's comment by way of opening up?
Well, I think Ansari's comment was more in the nature of an aside as to how the move towards world historical or civilizational approaches may be kind of co-opting Kerala into these larger paradigms rather than starting from the standpoint of Kerala in order to expand our notions of what constitutes these processes. As a general remark, I think he may be broadly correct, but if I look at the work that is going on right now, particularly the work of younger scholars like Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Kuria, Ehsan Ihtisham, and so on, what they're doing is proceeding from the standpoint of Mapala history, Mapala texts, Arabi Malayalam, in order to qualify a larger picture of Indian Ocean Islam that has emerged with the works of Niall Green, Ronit Ritchie, and so on. So what we have here is a set of very adventurous and very rooted young scholars who make Kerala their standpoint for looking at the world. But if you to go even earlier, to go back to what I started with in terms of looking at Balakrishna and Alangulam as well, Balakrishna standpoint was decoloniality avant les lettres, as the French would say. It's just decolonial stand that existed before even the term came into existence. Because if you remember, in his essays on Kerala history, which begin with Rome, his central point is that thinking about the Roman Empire and its imperial formation necessitates a thinking from Kerala, because a lot of the tribute in the wars between Carthage and Rome was paid in pepper, which came from Kerala. You find evidence of this in Pliny lamenting the drain of wealth. If Dadabhai Naoroji spoke about the drain of wealth from India to England, Pliny was talking about the drain of wealth from the Roman Empire to Kerala, which is what prompted Balakrishna to ask, is Rome a chapter in the history of Kerala, or is Kerala a chapter in the history of Rome? Now, nothing more decolonial can be imagined than the standpoint which relegates the great Roman Empire to a chapter in the history of Kerala's economic and political production. So I think it's a question of a strain that has always been present in the writing of Kerala history, which is thought with Kerala's position as a kind of axis, a hinge in a larger maritime civilization, and other kinds of approaches which have been very myopic, turned inwards into land, which have also reflected the social predilections of the historians. Hindu historians writing about Hindu dominance in what they perceived as a largely Hindu territory, with the histories of Muslims, Christians, Jews confined to the margins, as it were. Right? So, these are large historiographical points, and I just want to lay them out there and not belabor them. I look forward to more questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I could see that in the chat box already a conversation between Devika and Dileep has occurred. So I would request Devika to reflect briefly on all the four speeches that were made here. If she is here, I cannot see her, but I believe she is present here.
In more than spirit.
I am here. Yes, I am. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I actually missed this panel because of some health reasons. Otherwise, I would have been here. And I would have prepared better, but it was a pleasure to listen to all of you. Mike, of course, I've had, what should I say? I mean, I was just thinking how much of a man in this panel is, you know? I mean, no offense, because Dilip did invite me, but I'm not the only woman historian around. There are plenty of women historians of Malabar, whom, and young ones particularly, very interesting young people whom you could have. So I want to first of all register a little bit of a protest on this being a manner. But then perhaps I'm not really very surprised because you see, you know, when you people reflecting on your times of the 1980s about Calicut University, about the conversations, I remember, you know, either at the very margins, just listening to what was going on, and well, I don't think the kind of questions that were important to me would have even been struck any of you as, you know, important. It would have probably thought being understood as some kind of, you know, feminist hysteria, you know, breaking out. That's how it was in the 1980s. We all know. I'm so glad we are out of that time, and I'm genuinely glad we are able to reflect on some of the patriarchs of that time from this distance. For that opportunity, I'm genuinely thankful. Now, the question that I made in the chat box was for Dilip. So I was just thinking about the celebration of cultural symbiosis of the 1970s. How much did that have with, you know, did they even notice the fact that these communities which had these links across the seas, did they not have an alignment, a close alignment with the Janmabhedam order, which was definitely the you know, the form of social power in Kerala at that time, and definitely these communities were definitely part of that order, even when they were not really technically speaking castes. But and this strikes me particularly strongly because when you think of other communities like the Parangis, for example, who were a mix of people from all over Southeast Asia, converts to the Catholic faith more, and settled in places like Kollam and Kochi. I mean, if you think about the Parangi community, nobody really talks about, you know, when you talk about Cochin cosmopolitanism, Nandi doesn't even see this. So I was just asking about, you know, how much the idea of cultural symbiosis was in a sense blind to the fact that this kind of, whatever if you can call it cosmopolitanism, was definitely a kind of fastest phenomenon. It was a fastest cosmopolitanism. And that was the question I was asking Dilip, and I want to put it before the whole panel. And I think in an oblique way, Sanal touched upon it in his presentation. About Ansari's presentation, definitely the crisis part is a fabulous. You know, it got me thinking again because there is a crisis in history. I mean, I think many of us, like surely people like you and Ansari, the kind of work that we have produced. I mean, you're not exactly, maybe you're not directly trained as a historian, but definitely your work is, you know, the fact that we all found that history is very important to answering our questions. As young people, you know, in Kerala, at some point of time, between the 1970s and now, I think says that that was a crisis which would soon translate into a crisis of historical knowledge itself in Kerala, and I think that has borne fruit in the fact that we do now have a whole variety of fields which which really are another generation from, say, the work of M.G.S. Narayanan or Raghavan or Dr. Rajan Gurpal and so on. So this is a different generation, and I think even if philosophy hasn't borne fruit, history definitely has, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. And that has happened in Kerala itself. It's not, um, not just Malayalis working outside Kerala, but technically. But you're right, because it is the connection with universities outside Kerala that I think gave us the confidence to raise these questions in the first place. So it's very clear that, whatever Deshiyavadam that we have, this Vaganna Mudal Kanyakumari imagination, did not help us. It was stepping outside those boundaries, which definitely both processing as well as to the academic anthropologists of India. About Manu's, I think Manu, you have thrown up so many interesting ideas. It's worth, for example, one needs to think through this kind of militarism. The certain, I'm thinking about the present also, about, about the performance of violence in Kerala, about generally there is a way in which violence is so intrinsic to and so normalized in Malayali social life that you don't even notice. You always notice it when it happens in Tamil Nadu or North India or any other part of the world, but it happens right here and you don't even notice. And what kind of historical work do we need to understand contemporary cultural phenomena like violence, the latent violence in Malayali society, which is so hidden to most of us down here, not just because of this developmentalist discourse that tells us that Malayali modernity will solve all our problems, but also because perhaps of much more long-durate kinds of cultural lingerings, which might be interesting for us to explore. I'm very happy to hear that. But I also hope we, going back to Dilip's presentation, I was thinking maybe we should also think of, I don't know, I'm just asking Dilip, do you think about the work of Raghavan and others, who looked at Sri Lanka, the connections between Kerala and Sri Lanka, for example? Are they continuations of, do they take off from Kesari in some sense, or, so that's a question I'd like to ask. I hope that's enough, but I honestly would have prepared better.
Thank you so much, Devika. In fact, we have approached Devika, Arunima, and Janaki Nair to join the panel. But I can see Janaki Nair also present here. Meanwhile, we have two more questions. Dilip, Manu, and all four panelists, would you like to go now, responding to Devika? Please.
Maybe do that, because I suspect the questions might be on different themes. And I don't
please.
want to lose what
Start with
Devika
Dilip,
said.
then to Manu.
Now, I'd like to just respond quickly to Devika. The reason, as you noticed, the moment you asked the question, Devika, about the limitations of the idea of cultural symbiosis, I agreed with you, because, but we must also remember that MGS's book, Cultural Symbiosis in Kerala, was written in 1972. I was a mere 10 years old then, and the historiographical paradigm then was largely non-cognizant of the issue of caste. One could argue that perhaps caste has still not emerged as a paradigm with which to think the fractures within Kerala society, which will take us to the questions of the Parangis and other groups that we are talking about right now. So I am in agreement with you. With regard to militarism, I think there's a very fundamental question that we need to raise here, because the question of militarism, military fiscalism, the idea of the Nayars as a military group, a whole set of issues of that kind are also related to the fantasy or historical fantasy of the martial races in Kerala, where what we had, I suspect, and if you were to think along with Ambedkar, was a low-grade violence inflicted on lower caste groups, on untouchables, the kind of work that Sanal's work has actually reminded us of. So what we're thinking about is really a low-grade violence which continues into the present, and where impunity, to use V. Gita's wonderful word to characterize caste society in India, that this is something that is not subject to the restrictions of law. So I think we have to rethink this history of militarism in Kerala and see it as a function of an inordinate use of violence to maintain hierarchies, which then we subsequently, nostalgically, and sentimentally come to see as militarism. So anyway, I just want to put that out there. With regard to the last point that you raised, it's quite possible that Kesari Balarikshapilla's influence is much wider than we are willing to admit, where it is actually talking about cross-maritime connections with other spaces, the movement of peoples, a connection with histories that are larger than something that we've come to know as Indian histories. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Manu, your reflections? Yeah.
I made a small point.
Yeah, please.
No, I was thinking also, it's time I think we started thinking about the instruments of power in pre-modern, the Janmabhedam order. And I think the main instrument of power, or the mode of exercise of power, is much more of abjection, what is called abjection, rather than deprivation. And abjection would require a inordinately high use of normalized, everyday, low-grade violence. So I just want to say that.
Manu, your reflections.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dilip and Dr. Devika. In fact, I was talking about violence, but I realized that I never used the word violence. I'm glad both of you pointed to that. And there is also this interesting context of a very wonderful book that Bhupinder Singh wrote recently on political violence in early India, which richly documents the history of violence and which enables us to rethink this whole idea that we were a mostly peaceful civilization. A similar kind of history for Kerala would be a wonderful thing to do. And I think when you do that, one of the things that you cannot miss is the question of caste. But unfortunately, there is not much about caste in the surviving Perumal period documents. But we already noticed by the time of Barbosa that the kind of caste segmentation that you had in the 19th century was already there in the 16th century. So there is also a very, very profound way in which whole history has been erased from the existing archive. I don't say erased, it was never recorded. So when you look at caste in the 12th century, or when you look at caste in the 13th or 14th century, all we can do is name a few castes without telling us much about the chemistry between them. And I also notice a question, there's a comment there, is the KERALOLPATTI connection with Parashurama a Brahmin question of Brahmin domination? It is. So it's very closely related to that. And the Parashurama story is not unique to Kerala. It is there throughout the West Coast. It begins in Sopara. The Sopara in Gujarat is actually Shurparaka. There are some versions of KERALOLPATTI which says that it is not a Maru, but it's a Shurpam, which he hurled into the sea. Shurpam is a Moram. So the Shurparaka becomes a Sopara. You have a similar story about a place called Banali in Goa. So there it's a Bana, it's an arrow which is cast into the sea, and the sea moves away from that. You also have that in Kalidasa, who writes about Aparanta. Aparanta is a part of the Konkan coast in Maharashtra. Ramatso Taridat Sahyalagna, Ramanda Astram കൊണ്ട് സഹ്യലഗ്നമായ കടൽ പുറമോട്ട് പോയി. So you have that kind of thing, and the whole lot comes from the privileged position that Brahmins had along the west coast. And I think MGS has written at great length about that. So yes, we need to think of the whole thing in terms of violence and caste. And there is much to write about violence from at least the 9th century, when the historical archives in Kerala opens up, but not much about caste, at least up to the 15th or 16th century. It's unfortunate, but that's a fact.
Dilip, I just have a point to make.
Yeah, you should.
I was almost resigned.
Every question addressed to you, Sanal.
No, it's a very short response.
Yeah, please.
I used to feel for a very long time that this whole idea of cultural symbiosis, although it is a fantastic concept, it hides a lot of things which I would suggest as cultural hegemony. This is one thing that is there in my mind. And the other one about violence and caste. I just made some allusions to it, and the kind of archive that I am familiar with, because I work mostly with this Protestant missionary archive and some of these, British colonial archives, and I found that there is a huge amount of materials that really talk about, the kind of violence that existed in Kerala. No matter whether you're talking about Malabar or Cochin or Travancore, which I'm sure those who have worked, and Dilip also knows well, he has worked in the missionary archive. And everybody knows that this is completely documented, actually, the kind of violence which has been there. And then obviously those who were controlling land, they control violence, and therefore, if you look at the everyday life of the oppressed caste, then I think we cannot write a history of that without considering the question of violence. And there is, I guess, immense documents to write a history of that. Yeah, so I have been attempting that sort of things. Yes, thank you very much.
Sanal, there is a question from Dr. Gasper addressed to you in the chat box. Is experience a monolithic or homogeneous notion?
Some raised hands.
Okay, I will be very quick. And obviously, what he said is correct, and I also said that it is nothing monolithic. So it depends on what you are looking at, where you are looking at, and whose narratives you are listening to. Therefore, it differs. It is different from different sections, or it is different across social groups, across gender group. Gender. If you take gender as a category, for example, you find again the same kind of differences being articulated. So therefore, I never said that it is monolithic, and I know that it is very complex. It is. If I ever say that it is monolithic, then I'm not a researcher in this particular area at all, which means that I haven't learned anything. So therefore, my limited understanding tells me that it is completely complex and it varies across time, space, and so on, and of course across social groups. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As for those raised hands, I think those are inadvertent. Manoj or Faisal, if you have anything to ask, please go ahead. If there were accidental hand raisings, we will move on to Ansari. Ansari, would you like to chime in here? Ansari?
Yeah. Actually, nothing much to add. One question was there in the chat which I have responded. That is one. I was, as I said, I was not using a what you call blanket condemnation of the practice of historical regimen. Anyway, but what I was actually hinting is that in other disciplines, especially in literature, for that matter, whether it is English literature or comparative literature, etc., there is a sense of a constant crisis. Because most other disciplinary crises in other disciplines are easily resolved or protocols are established. So this is a kind of a temporary measure, or which seeks a resolution, whereas we have to live with a sense of a deep crisis which cannot be resolved. So it is not like every 10 years we have a crisis. No, it is a discipline in crisis which actually raises larger questions about the disciplinary formation, the time and space of when these disciplines were put together. The logic of that formation itself becomes deeply questionable. And to make another provocative statement, in a sense, history doesn't matter. What historical records prove about certain places, etc., is irrelevant. So there is probably a need for history to refine its moorings, there you get the response.
Yeah, I think.
Now I think you are misrepresenting history. I'm very sorry to say that, because you seem to be pitched on to some particular idea of history, some kind of empirical, some kind of an empiricist kind of history, which I don't think exists anymore. I mean, in history now, at least exists not just as a discipline, but actually as a methodological orientation that is relevant to almost all disciplines. So that's all I can say here.
Yeah, probably I am belaying the point, but my idea is that it is not as if literature is immune. The same accusations can be thrown to literature departments across India. But then it is probably happening more in such departments than. Whether that more is a mark of quality is a different question.
But perhaps you could move on to more substantial issues.
Yeah, definitely.
I think the issue of the archive has been raised critically in this debate. I mean, memory, the issue of memory. If you all can have, I mean, if there are no other comments from the audience, anybody, if you want to make any comments, please. Otherwise, I will ask all the panelists to reflect again. I think that will be a bit unjust asking you again. So I would rather request Dr. Dineshan and Dr. Abhilash to comment on any of these presentations so that we can...
Actually, Abhilash is not here. He is not well, okay. And so he will not be coming in.
Your observations, Dineshan?
Actually, I have some observation, but I would like to ask a question like something to Dilip Menon. This is something related to his idea of terrestrial and maritime history. The two forms of history he's trying to differentiate. I'm sure that he is not reducing both these terms, terrestrial as well as maritime, into any kind of geographical units. There may be some beyond geographical unit. These terms might have some other meanings, other conceptual input. Would you comment on that? Whether are you reducing these two things into geography, or are you going beyond that? That's not very clear. I think I didn't get whether we are moving beyond geographical units. That's one thing. Secondly, the new kind of history some people are trying to write. They are not into kind of territorial maritime history or any kind of global history, whether it is global south or world history or global assets. But they are trying to say that history should be written from kind of what is called planetary history kind of things. So how do you differentiate your idea from that kind of history as well? These are the two questions which I would like to put before Dilip. And towards Manu, actually it's very interesting, his observations. What I felt is that actually Manu, if we are pursuing along with Manu's argument, we may have to rethink on the whole question of power relations, which Dumo once tried to produce. Like it's not. He was trying to differentiate between profane and sacred, and sacred would encompass the profane kind of things, and that's his fundamental idea about the Indian society and caste structure, caste hierarchy. Actually, Manu is bringing an interesting idea towards that kinds of discussion. So it's I would like to tell you that a PhD thesis by anthropologist and performance studies person Richard Freeman. He wrote an interesting PhD thesis on a regional kingdom in northern part of Kerala, Allada, Neeleshwaram Swarupam. And he also taking some ideas which Manu was addressing. Like he says that it's not only violence and sacred things. There are even other forms of power which includes the magical power of the lower community, lower caste. And actually, Manu's intervention asks us to rethink the whole idea of the relationship between power and violence and profane power and the ritual power on the one side, and the things like that. These are the two things which I wanted to comment on. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Dilip and Manu in that order.
See, I think the question of how we are to look at the space that we call Kerala, right, beyond a regional upper caste circumscribed imagination and beyond the national imagination, which Kerala is a region within the nation. I think this is an important question for us, and this is why I spoke about Balakrishna Birla, who introduced a kind of thematic thinking that if you're thinking with the idea of Parashurama and the recovery of land from the waters, that you have to engage with ideas of the flood, which are prevalent all over the world. Right? I mean, you have to think about the Middle East, you have to think about the Chinese flood, and so on and so forth. So the time span may extend from 1,000 to 5,000 years, even though you might be writing about the present. You might be writing about something that happened 300 or 400 years ago. So this question, both the question of time and space get complicated. To give you an anecdotal kind of thing, in 1414, a giraffe leaves Malindi in Africa and en route to becoming a present to Emperor Yongle in China. The boat docks in Kozhikode, it docks in Bengal, and then it moves on to China, where the giraffe is presented to the emperor, who is less than happy with the present, but that's another story. So here again, if we think about this particular example, we're thinking about imaginations of territory, movements through territory of animals and humans that exceed the space that we call Kerala. Right? So depending upon the theme that we are looking at, whether it's a history of pepper, it's a history of migration. So Dubai is now like another district of Kerala. When we think about the large-scale process of immigration that has happened, the second wave from the 70s and the oil crisis and so on. So Dubai has to be studied as an integral part of Kerala. Just as much as in the 15th century, Kerala was part of a much larger geography that extended from Aden to Malacca. Right? So, I mean, this is just to put that on the table. Now, the terrestrial and maritime history question is just a way of heuristically posing a problem of where is Kerala? And that would depend upon what the problem that you're looking at is. With regard to planetary history, the only word of caution that I'd like to introduce into this discussion is that when we increasingly we are drawn towards the ideas of post-human history, planetary history, and a lot of these are emerging out of largely white academic departments in the United States and so on, because fundamental to our existence on the planet are racial and caste hierarchies where the question of the human itself has not been resolved. Right? When you think about India, what is the worth of a life of a Dalit? When you think about the United States, what is the worth of a life of a black man who can be shot in the back and the perpetrator can go unpunished? So the question of the human itself has to be resolved to begin with. So even as we engage in these theoretical forays into planetary history, post-human history, and so on and so forth, we have to think about the fact that there is a certain kind of illusion that is happening here of the worth of human life that we need to be constantly aware of. And this is something that African American historical writing, Dalit historical writing, feminist historical writing has constantly reminded us of. So anyway, those are two large answers to the questions that the nation posed.
Yeah, Manu, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Dineshan. I think the question of power that you raised is a little more intricate and a little more complicated when you compare what is happening in Kerala to other parts of South India and South Asia at large. this is we also need to bring in the question of what narrative frames many of these groups, political groups, communities, etc., had in mind when they were producing the kind of power structures and they were producing the kind of narratives themselves. One instance would be the Adhyatma Ramayanam of Ezhuthachan. Another would be the Mahabharata of Ezhuthachan. These are all stories of patrilineal families, and the texts in Kerala were meant to circulate among matrilineal families. So what were they doing there? You have this kind of tricky questions. You have this kind of issues with the KERALOLPATTI as well. The story of a king dividing, parceling the authority among a number of subordinates goes back to the Kakatiya period. The last Kakatiya ruler, Prataparudra, divided the kingdom among all the the so-called Padmanayakas, and the same story is narrated for Krishnaraya. Krishnaraya, the Vijayanagara king, divides the kingdom among his subordinates, and the same story is told in the KERALOLPATTI of the last Perumal ruler parceling out Kerala amongst the 17 of his Samantas. So obviously the narrative is drawn from elsewhere. Even the story of Padamala Nair that you have in the KERALOLPATTI is drawn from the Kumararama tradition of Karnataka through Tamil Nadu, where it metamorphoses into the Sarangadhara narrative. So you have all these intricate and tricky issues, of narrative borrowed out of context, being in circulation here in very, very interesting ways. So I think without a kind of comparison of what is happening in the rest of South Asia, it would be a bit risky to come up with very neat formulations about what power is doing or what power is not doing in a place like Kerala. That would be my response.
Yeah, I think you are coming to the, if any of you, including Devika, wants to make any closing comments, take 1 minute and make that closing comment. I will start with Ansari this time, then go on to Sanal Marsh and others. Ansari.
Yeah. As I said, my limited brief was only to as a respondent, and one of the things which I wanted to raise was the kind of dialectic between culture and civilization, where even now we are not able to. We are encomposed in an Indian civilization. So why can't we pluralize that? And there is a fear, there is a problem, there is an inability to raise that. So that is one of the reasons why I was sort of using the polarization of culture. So we are, there is an affirmation of cultures, different cultures, but the civilizational angle or the larger ambit seem to be, I'm not saying that there is not work happening. Probably that is part of the task in front of us. Thank you.
Sanal Marsh. This time you can open the video so that we can see you.
Okay, thank you very much. To me, I think it's a matter of complicating our certainties, narratives, and so on. So I will think about that's where we are learning.
Thank you so much.
You have to do something about your audio. It's really.
Did you hear me? I thought you heard me. No, what I said, basically, I will really think more about this. And one of the things I learned in this session is to complicate the narrative that we are familiar with, and also to be self-reflexive about the kind of things that we are talking about.
Thank you so much. Devika, any parting thoughts?
Or parting shots?
No shots, yeah, I would have loved a shot of whiskey or something, but that's not possible. Anyway, but then, any parting thoughts? Yes, and Manu, I mean, at some point of time, we need to, sit together and brainstorm and come up with a number of abductive hypotheses, because I think you specialize in, throwing out abductive reasoning. I mean, you engage in that quite a bit, and I find it very engaging. And one of the things that you just said about matrilineal texts circulating in matrilineal families is something I've been thinking about also. So, I mean, I suppose this is the best tribute one can pay a scholar like NGS, that conversation for his birthday seems to have, thrown up so many different interesting ideas to explore. I'm sure that's what he would have, he wants, and that's the best tribute that we can pay him. I'll just stop.
Thanks, Manu.
Well, I don't have much to say. It's been wonderful being here. And I have not met any of you except Professor Dilip Menon. Very briefly, that was in 2009 when we had the conference in honor of Rajan Gurukal in Kottayam during his retirement. I just spoke to him for 2 minutes when we were having paramburi in the chai break. And I also saw Dileep Raj there, but I don't remember having a conversation with him. But otherwise, I haven't met any of you. So it's wonderful being here with you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Dilip, where do we go from here? Your final words.
Where do we go from here? I suspect we're all going home for dinner. But apart from that, I think, what struck me in all of this is that since this discussion has been convened in honor of Professor M.G.S. Narayanan achieving the age of 90, which is a remarkable achievement, even given the advanced life expectancies of our times. And as we were discussing this, I was thinking that I was reminded of a biblical proverb, judge not lest ye be judged, because while we were making these critical remarks about a whole body of vast scholarship, which goes back to the 1960s, it's important to remember that these were all major interventions in their time. Whatever MGS wrote created a whole body of scholarship, created a whole set of people who followed and opened up new paths. And I suspect the generations to follow us will also see our work, no matter how path-breaking and original and iconoclastic we see our work to be, we might see our own work, whether it's Devika's or mine or anybody's, is work that was extremely conventional in spirit. And this is the way in which knowledge progresses. So all I would like to say at the end of this is to say that I would like to thank MGS for having opened up multiple avenues for research, of which I and many of my generation were the beneficiary. And he has always been a good sounding board for our ideas, just as I hope that our work, the work that Devika, myself, Manu, Sanal have been doing, will be a sounding board for the generations to follow. And I hope they will be as severe with us as we are with MGS.
I would request O.P. Raveendran, who is one of the partners of BOOKART, which is an online bookshop which has taken initiative in organizing all these things, to extend vote of thanks. Ravi.
I think I am audible.
Ravi.
Yes, you are. Okay. Thank you. On the second day of MGS at 90, being organized as part of BOOKART, we carried on from where we left yesterday. Drawing from their diverse area, explore adults